Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast. We are headed into our final segment of the day. We are going to be talking some college basketball. Just a reminder here that for our viewers to use the chat, make this show as interactive as possible. But talking college basketball from last night, we had a whirlwind of different games where we will start off by talking about the few teams that punched their ticket to the dance with some conference titles, starting with McNeese beating Nichols to win the Southland Conference Tournament Final. This is a really big win for McNeese, who, if you haven't heard of them from this year, they have been on a terrific tear this year, winning 30 games this season. They could have possibly been an at-large bid if they didn't win the conference tournament, but they would have been right on that bubble, and I think that despite the 30 wins, it could have been really tough for them to make it into the tournament. Instead, they do. They finish off their season well, and they're going to be a very interesting team here when the brackets are released. This is their first tournament appearance since 2002, and they could definitely be seen as a popular Cinderella team. I think they are going to. They'll probably be in that 12-13 seed range, and we all know the nation's love for a good 12 seed as a Cinderella run. I think that McNeese could potentially be that Cinderella team. Other teams that made their way into the tournament with wins yesterday is Colgate. They rode a hot first half against Lehigh to handedly beat them and win the Patriot League. This is the fourth time they have reached the fourth straight season they have reached the tournament. They were a popular upset team last year. They did not do so and have really flown more under the radar this season, which I think potentially makes them even scarier as a first round upset. So another team to look out for. And then you had Montana State beating Montana in the Big Sky Championship, where this was a little bit of a disappointing season for the Bobcats. This is their third straight Big Sky Championship, so they've been here before, but they were just 500 on the season as a whole. Ultimately, though, they win their tournament, they win their conference tournament, and they will be in the big dance. We also had a set of wild games from the major conferences as well. We had Clemson suffering a blowout loss that could really put their at-large bid in jeopardy. They lost 76-55 against Boston College. The Eagles now have a couple of dominant wins to try and put together a Cinderella run for themselves. But for Clemson here, they lose their last two games of the season to BC now, and they also lost to Wake Forest in the last game of the regular season, and they do so against BC in ugly fashion. The ACC has not seemed to get a lot of love from the national media and the selection committee this season. We know that Duke and UNC are locks, but outside of that, there is a lot up in the air. There is Clemson, Wake Forest, Virginia, and Pittsburgh all on the bubble. Syracuse was in that same tier a little bit as well until they lost to NC State yesterday, and now they'll be out. I think Clemson should be in, but it is definitely harmful the way that yesterday went for them, and at this point it's in the committee's hands now. Another team on the bubble that played in a wild, surprising game was Villanova, almost completely blowing their chances at making the tournament when they went down to the wire against DePaul. Nova entered the game as 24.5-point favorites, but it took a Justin Moore three with 8 seconds left in the game to retake the lead and escape with a win, keep their season alive. DePaul this season was 3-28 in the regular season, 0-20 in conference play in the Big East, but they led this game by as much as 8 points in the second half. That 8-point lead that they had just under 13 minutes was the largest lead they held in conference play all season long. And Nova even ended up evening up the score, took a brief lead. DePaul took it back with a jumper from Jalen Terry to make it 57-55. DePaul with 1:13 left in the game. Nova misses a shot. DePaul actually gets a couple rebounds, a couple offensive rebounds, but is not able to capitalize on it, and it was Moore ending up hitting the game winner. But this was not a convincing performance for Nova if they want to show they are worthy of a tournament spot. No question now, they have to beat Marquette. Tonight, the game tips off at 9:30. It might also take another win afterwards, likely against Creighton. We'll see how that all plays out. But we've seen Villanova play down to competition this season, but this was new lows for them, especially being that it was with their season on the line, essentially. So we will see how that all plays out for the Wildcats, but DePaul was not the only winless team in conference play that almost pulled off a shocker yesterday, and we won't spend too much time on this because I don't imagine either of these teams to be in the tournament, but was just shocking that an 8-24 Missouri team took Georgia down to the wire as well. They fell apart down in the stretch of that game. They led late, but could not hold on. Mizzou was 0-18 in the SEC this year. They come short of claiming a conference win where they had it in their hands but let it slip away from them late in that game against Georgia. Georgia, this was not quite as big of a potential upset. I remember looking at the line before the game. Georgia was just favored by 2.5 points. Was very strange for a Missouri team that hadn't won a single game in the SEC to be that close in terms of betting odds. But Georgia does end up winning. They end up covering for anybody who did bet on that game, but definitely a weird one in that. We also had Cincinnati beat Kansas. This wasn't a massive surprise. Kansas was without their top two players in Hunter Dickinson and Kevin McCullough Jr. They made it a little bit of a ball game in the second half. KJ Adams had himself a really nice scoring performance, especially getting going in the second half, but it just was not enough to keep up with Cincinnati that was at full strength. They ended up losing 72-52. Ultimately, we sort of knew this was likely going to happen, but it just does go to show additionally the state of Kansas Jayhawks basketball this year, where they are so top heavy, and outside of KJ Adams, nobody else was able to step up for them. Elmarco Jackson, the freshman who started the year for them, he was just 2 of 11. Nicholas Timberlake was 2 of 9, and Johnny Furphy, the other freshman who was a little bit of a revelation emerging for the Jayhawks midway through the season, now could be a potential first-round pick in the draft. He was 1 for 8. He's been struggling from a scoring perspective as of late, and I don't see it really with this Kansas team. Now, we know how good their starting lineup is, but if you are able to jam Hunter Dickinson, there isn't a great amount of shooting from the outside. They can play some defense when they're fully healthy, but again, this wasn't a surprise result by any means, really. It would have been a huge statement had they won, but it sort of reaffirms their issues where they're not a great shooting team. They don't have very much help outside of their top 3. Again, credit to KJ Adams for the performance that he tried to put on here, 9 of 14 from the field, and carried them as much as he personally could, but they end up falling short in this one to Cincinnati. We will see them again when the tournament begins. We also had Utah dominate Arizona State last night. Utah is hovering around one of those bubble spots, probably a little more so on the outside looking in. And there were some doubts with them whether or not they would have their leading scorer, Braden Carlson, for the game. He did played limited minutes, just 18, only scored, I believe it was 7 points. So not like it was a tremendous performance for him personally, but it did not end up mattering. The rest of the team really showed up big time for them. And it's going to be interesting. They face off against Colorado tonight. Two teams that are on that little bit of a bubble line, have some arguments to make the tournament, and there's a chance that they both could make it, but depending on how this game goes, we could see at least one of them eliminated, and even then, we'll see. I think that Colorado has the advantage in this particular matchup, but I guess we'll also just have to see, because it's not that the committee takes into consideration recent play as much as they used to either, and Colorado has been playing some good basketball. But that is all we have time for on the show today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you may be keeping up with us. We will be back tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock. Going to be a late one tonight if you are a college basketball fan watching that Utah-Colorado game. Tips off at 11:30 Eastern. But we will see you tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and thanks for listening. Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.